The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will come to order, and without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Moving the Money, Understanding the Iranian Regime's Access to Money Around the World and How They Use It to Support Terrorism. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the Chair for inclusion in the record. So I now will recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Mr. Goldberg, Mr. Noronha, and Mr. Thomas, I want to say thank you for being here. We appreciate your time. I know for at least 2 of you, you were also part of a hearing yesterday with my colleague Blaine Lukemeyer. So you're pulling to some double duty, and we do appreciate that. And at the end of the day, we are trying to find out how we can help stabilize the Middle East. That ultimately is the goal here. So let me be clear. Today's hearing should not be labeled as partisan. Members from both sides of the aisle have concerns about how the Iranian regime is able to support terrorism around the world, continue its march towards developing nuclear weapon capabilities, and suppress human rights of its own people. So let's begin today by setting the stage. Since 2021, the Iranian regime has profited nearly $80 billion from oil sales around the world, which is due in part to relaxed sanctions. Earlier this summer, reports indicated that the United States and Iran had resumed diplomatic engagements after the Biden administration failed to revive the Joint Comprehensive Plan, or JCPOA. In September, the United States and Iran finalized a swap involving the release of 5 American hostages in exchange for 5 Iranian nationals who had been charged with sanctions violations and federal crimes, while agreeing to give Iran access to approximately $6 billion in funds previously held in South Korea. Similarly, the administration waived sanctions to allow more than $10 billion worth of Iranian assets held in Iraq to be transferred to Oman and other jurisdictions. 3 weeks ago, Hamas committed just one of the most brutal terrorist attacks that we have ever seen on the state of Israel, and 30 Americans tragically lost their lives in that. It's important to note that Hamas receives approximately $350 million per year in support from Iran, or roughly 93% of their total funding. Finally, last week, the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee launched an investigation to better understand the administration's decisions regarding economic sanctions on the Iranian regime. So today's hearing will focus around 3 central questions. First, how restricted Iranian funds are held around the world and how the Iranian regime accesses them. Second, understanding the genesis of the $6 billion used as negotiating terms to release the hostages in Iran. Is that in fact what happened? And third, how the administration helped the Iranian regime more easily access an additional $10 billion paid by Iraq for electricity. Here's what Congress can do. First, we can push for greater transparency when any administration is choosing to waive sanctions that have been passed by this body, especially as negotiating terms in any hostage deal with the Iranian regime. Members of this body should not be kept in the dark, and consequences are too great. Next, we do not allow sanctions to be waived, rolled back, or funds transferred. Time and time again, Iran has shown that it's willing to starve its own people in pursuit of supporting terrorism or achieving a nuclear weapon. Naively believing that diplomatic agreements will deter Iranian regime, the Iranian regime will be done at our own peril. We must cripple their economy and return the previous administration's maximum pressure campaign, in my opinion. Let me close with this. I know there's a lot of different opinions about what is happening in Gaza and with the Palestinians and with Israel, but we should all agree that innocent civilians should not be used as political cover. Make no mistake, Hamas is no friend of the Palestinian people, in my opinion, and the Iranian regime is no friend of ours. We must not waver in our support for our ally of Israel. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I'm going to yield back the balance of my time, and I now will, I think the chairman now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, gentleman from Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. And I thank the witnesses for appearing as well. Mr. Chairman, this hearing is ostensibly being held to investigate how Iran accesses restricted funds around the world, looking at two instances where the United States has granted waivers for Iran to access these specific restricted funds. Some of my colleagues across the aisle, however, may try to link these waivers to the attacks in Israel. This would be a callous attempt to politicize what is already a horrific crisis. We cannot allow this hearing to become a distraction action by my colleagues across the aisle from 23 days of legislative inaction. We cannot allow the blame game with political fallacies to masquerade as proven facts. Let's examine some of the political fallacies refuted by proven facts. Political fallacy 1. The $6 billion transferred from South Korea to Qatar has been handed over to Iran. Proven fact, not a scintilla of a cent. Some things bear repeating. Not a scintilla of a cent has been released to Iran. On October 12, 2023, the US and Qatar agreed to restrict the funds in response to the attack on Israel. Political fallacy. The $6 billion are US taxpayer dollars. Proven fact. US presidents, including President Trump, have granted waivers for countries to purchase Iranian oil with each country's own money. No president has given foreign countries taxpayer dollars to purchase Iranian oil. Political fallacy. President Biden shouldn't allow Iraq to purchase electricity from Iran. Proven fact. Former President Trump allowed Iraq to buy electricity from Iran with the justification that Iraq had a fragile economy. Should former President Trump be denounced for allowing Iraq to buy electricity from Iran? In closing, I ask this. I ask this of my Republican colleagues. Where were you when President Trump allowed 8 countries to purchase oil from Iran? Where were you when former President Trump allowed Iraq to purchase electricity from Iran? And why is there no mention of President Trump in your distraction action memo? Now, to some things that the ranking member and I can agree on. What he said about Israel and what happened there, I think we can find common ground on. It was a horrific event. It is something that never should have happened and never should happen again. But we also have to concern ourselves with peace. And you have to concern yourself with peace at the genesis of war, else you may not know what type of war to execute. And we also have to concern ourselves with humanitarian aid for the Palestinians. There are many other things that we might agree on, but I do believe we agree on some of these. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the time, and I yield back.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And we'll get to a number of those issues that the ranking member has brought up. And today, we welcome the testimony of Mr. Richard Goldberg. Mr. Goldberg is the Senior Advisor for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Gabriel Noronha. Mr. Noronha is a fellow with the Gemunder Center for Defense and Strategy at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. And Mr. Clayton Thomas One of our own is a specialist in the Middle Eastern affairs at the Congressional Research Service. So thank you all, gentlemen, for being here. We thank you for your time. We know it's valuable, especially for those of you pulling double duty. And your written statements will be made a part of the permanent record without objection. So, Mr. Goldberg, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member. Great to be back in this chamber a few hours later for the double duty, but a really important topic and work. I do hope we can find bipartisan common ground here. I do want to address some of the ranking members' last comments and questions because I can answer them pretty quickly and easily. Where was I when President Trump issued oil waivers? Well, in 2018, I was at FDD opposing those waivers, and in 2019, I was in the National Security Council ending them because we ended them in May of 2019. So I don't know where this talking point keeps coming from that Trump did this too. Maximum pressure started in May 2019, Congressman. We ended the oil waivers. All that money went on lockdown and escrow accounts. They have not been reopened until this year, until these transfers. Where was I when we were granting waivers under the statute that I wrote as a staffer in 2012, the Iran Freedom Counterproliferation Act, when we allowed Iraq to continue importing electricity from Iran? First I was at FDD, and then I was in the National Security Council. And we worked with the Treasury Department and the State Department to ensure those funds were locked down. We allow, under the waiver, import of electricity. We don't allow Iran to access the funds. Now we do. So I don't know where all these claims keep coming from, but let's stick with facts. Let's stick with facts. If we today, in the wake of October 7th, agree that we need to do all we can to deny this regime in Tehran resources, that it is in our national security interest for the Islamic Republic of Iran to have less money, not more money, at its fingertips. Understanding the fungibility of money. Putting aside whether this $6 billion you're pointing to has been spent yet or borrowed against yet. An interesting question never asked. What about the $10 billion, Congressman? What about that money that was moved out of Iraq to Oman? We have no information about it. We just heard yesterday the waiver was just introduced into the record. We've just learned about it. What's been spent out of there? Is that money frozen? Have the Omanis agreed to that? Have the Iraqis agreed to that? When that waiver expires, will we revert to the old waiver and ensure that money in Baghdad gets locked down for electricity payments? We can allow Iraq to import electricity. We don't have to allow Iran access to the money. Oil sanctions. This isn't just new. This summer, we saw this massive spike as the secret nuclear deal that I outlined in my testimony, my written testimony, started. After Brett McGurk, the White House Middle East coordinator, had gone to Oman, negotiated through the Omanis a secret nuclear understanding, using all kinds of interesting pretexts and executive authorities to start releasing money and stop enforcing sanctions. Why? Because they knew politically they couldn't come to this House to submit a deal under the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act to evade the laws we have all passed, that you have all voted on in the past. Why did they do that? Because they wanted a nuclear understanding. They wanted to just say, oh, please, just don't go across that 90% enriched uranium threshold. We heard yesterday in testimony that, oh, we should never have gotten out of the JCPOA. Look at Iran's nuclear program today. The vast majority of Iran's advancement in its nuclear activities have happened since January 2021. That's when they crossed to 20% enriched uranium, and then to 60%. And now, just a stone's throw away, showing us their technical capability to get to 90%. Only when we went from maximum pressure to maximum concessions, maximum deference. The policy needs to change. Oil exports have been steadily rising with non-enforcement throughout 2021 and 2022. It was only this year that they went through the roof, with some reports topping 2 million barrels per day in August under this nuclear deal. And so, no, Congressman, I'm not saying this $6 billion was used to fund October 7th. That's factually inaccurate. But a posture of appeasement for 2.5 years that emboldens this regime. A summer negotiated secret nuclear understanding that allows this regime to say, well, the Americans are off the table. They're afraid of us. They're deterred. We've already cut a pact with Saudi Arabia, too, through the Chinese earlier in the year. Now we can turn all of our sights on Israel, the only country in the Middle East operating inside of Iran to stop that nuclear program. Now we can activate all of our terror tentacles that we, the IRGC, coordinate in Beirut, a cell coordinating Hezbollah, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad. That's what we need to come together to say, let's lock down these resources. Let's turn our posture from appeasement to deterrence, to pressure. That is how we take on the terror tentacles of Tehran. Look forward to your questions today. Thank you so much for holding this hearing. I know that Qatar came up yesterday. There may be a hostage deal today involving Qatar. I think it's important we address that in the double game Qatar plays, but I look forward to your questions.
Our witnesses will be reminded that they need to address their remarks to the chair specifically. So I appreciate your passion, Mr. Goldberg, and I look forward to exploring a few of those issues. So, Mr. Noronha, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Huizenga. Thank you, Ranking Member Green, for having me and distinguished members of the committee. Over the past decade, the Islamic Republic of Iran has spent more than $20 billion to support foreign terror groups in the Middle East. It has spent tens of billions of its own dollars on its own terror operations. And I think it's important to understand when the Islamic Republic chants death to Israel, they chant death to America, they are really deadly serious about those chants. And we learned that 2 weeks ago. And Mr. Chairman, you are correct, this is not a partisan issue. There really ought to be. They would not distinguish between Republicans and Democrats when they target us, and they don't in their ongoing assassination plots on U.S. soil. Hamas's attack on Israel was only possible because of increased funding from the Iranian regime over the last couple of years, not just in the last couple of months, but over the last couple of years. Historically, Iran has provided $100 million to Hamas. In the past year, that has increased to $350 million. And I think it's important to understand how they got to the position of being able to increase those funds. Today, Iran provides Hamas 93% of its military budget. That funding allowed Hamas to lay low over the last year and prepare for these sneak attacks. Iran also trained 500 Hamas fighters inside Iran as recently as September. I think that is certainly a contributing factor to the success of their operations. And the regime could afford this largesse because of the problems with financing that have really flooded in, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, $80 billion at least in oil sales since the beginning of 2021, the $10 billion that we'll discuss from Iraq, facilitated by State Department waivers, which I saw what you submitted into the record yesterday. They are very strange, having written them myself, very unprecedented. They may now be laundering that money through China to get rid of all humanitarian exemptions. And then the $6 billion that was deposited into Qatari accounts in exchange for the release of 5 Iranian-American hostages. There's also reports that Iran has gained access to $6.7 billion in IMF special drawing rights. That's very much in this committee's jurisdiction. Supreme Leader Khamenei's philosophy is to use all the funds it can obtain to advance its terrorism. They don't really care about providing for the material needs of the Iranian people. They will always prioritize terror. And the United States should not aid the regime in this effort. A few recommendations. Specifically, Congress should force the executive branch to enforce its existing oil sanctions against shipping companies, tanker companies, ports, refiners, insurance companies. There are over 300 tankers facilitating trade in Iranian oil which are not sanctioned today. The same and these sanctions need to be mandatory, not discretionary. The same applies to the United States sectoral sanctions against Iran's metals and petrochemical exports. Those sanctions have really not been enforced in the past 30 months. Second, Congress should work to bring an end to these ongoing energy waivers that we provide to Iraq, and make sure that those funds can't be laundered in China. This is a really serious terror financing threat. This issue has gone on for a long time, multiple administrations, and I think it's incumbent on Congress to find a solution with the executive branch on how we can wean Iraq off of Iranian energy independence, but then try to bring this to an end fast. Third, the United States must claw back the $6 billion provided to the Qatari fund for Iran last month. It has not been dispersed yet. My concern, based on Iranian budgeting principles, is that they plan out their foreign currency payments months in advance, and they were planning to draw down on this, and we're in the process of moving funds around until just now, I think. The deal we made with Iran in August and September became irrelevant the moment they funded the slaughter of 30 Americans in Israel last month and took a dozen more Americans hostage. We should not view that deal as having any legitimacy anymore. And I think the other point that's important to know is the regime has a long history of pilfering food and medicine to resell in the black market in Iraq and Afghanistan. The proceeds, even if we gave them food and medicine, would likely go to terror or be stolen by the regime elite. And so I believe Congress should rescind the September 11th waiver to formally and permanently freeze those funds and ultimately work to provide the funds to the victims of terror. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Thomas, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral remarks.
Chairman Huizenga, Ranking Member Green, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting the Congressional Research Service to testify today. This morning, I'll summarize my written statement on Iran's funds abroad, starting with a brief overview of the U.S. sanctions authorities that underpin the funds and their use, before focusing on the Biden administration's decision earlier this year to facilitate the transfer of $6 billion of those Iranian funds from South Korea to Qatar. I'll finish by suggesting some options and implications for congressional action. So, for background, the United States has for decades sought to limit the Iranian government's financial resources via sanctions in an effort to deprive the government of the ability to fund its programs to develop weapons of mass destruction and the means to deliver them, its nuclear activities, and its support for terrorist groups. Led by Congress, these U.S. efforts have included a decades-long effort to limit Iran's petroleum exports, a key revenue source for the regime. Starting in 2011, Congress authorized exceptions from U.S. sanctions for countries that otherwise could be subject to penalties for purchasing Iranian petroleum to continue such purchases if they gradually reduced their imports. Congress further mandated that accepted foreign buyers had to deposit payments for Iranian petroleum in financial institutions of the purchasing country, not in Iran. Congress explicitly permitted the use of those funds for humanitarian trade in multiple Iran-specific sanctions authorities, in line with long-standing provisions in U.S. law that exempt humanitarian goods like food and medicine from U.S. sanctions programs. Still, restrictions on those Iranian funds abroad lead many to describe them as frozen, as foreign financial institutions have generally restricted their use in order not to run afoul of U.S. law and themselves become potential targets for secondary sanctions. In September 2023, in conjunction with mutual prisoner releases from the United States and Iran, the U.S. approved the transfer of $6 billion in Iranian funds from South Korea to Qatar. These actions occurred in the context of broader diplomatic engagement to de-escalate U.S.-Iran tensions. To facilitate the transfer of funds, Secretary Blinken issued sanctions waivers to allow European financial institutions to participate without the risk of U.S. sanctions. Executive branch officials did not provide a detailed description of the oversight mechanisms that would have applied to the funds, but said that U.S. oversight in partnership with that of the government of Qatar would be substantial, and that the United States would take, quote, appropriate action if Iran attempted to use the funds for purposes other than non-sanctionable humanitarian trade. The September 7th, 2023 Hamas attacks on Israel and resulting conflict have prompted increased scrutiny of U.S. policy towards Iran, a longtime backer of Hamas. This scrutiny includes attention to the $6 billion transfer. According to press reports, Deputy Treasury Secretary Wally Adeyemo told legislators that in the wake of Hamas's assault on Israel, U.S. and Qatari officials had agreed to prevent the use of the funds indefinitely. The administration has not made any official statements on the status of those funds. Going forward, as part of its oversight responsibilities, Congress could consider whether or not to seek greater visibility into Iran's funds abroad, including via legislation to require regular reporting by the administration to Congress on the funds and their use. Congress could also consider whether or not to mandate congressional review of administration decisions with respect to the funds. Some members of Congress are urging or seeking to compel the administration to act in a demonstrable, transparent way to ensure the funds in Qatar are not used for transactions that would benefit the Iranian government. Since September 7th, members of Congress have introduced at least 18 pieces of legislation related to Iran. Many of those bills would rescind the waivers issued to facilitate the transfer and seek to encourage third parties to block or otherwise decline to conduct transactions with the funds. Other legislation would seek to confiscate and repurpose the funds, although the United States' ability to seize the funds appears to be limited, as the United States does not have jurisdiction over them. New official action to newly block the funds could provoke an Iranian response or have other impacts on U.S. interests, including with respect to Qatar, a major non-NATO ally of the United States that hosts major U.S. military facilities. Formal action to rescind the waivers or amend the authorities underlying them could also have implications for Iraq, which has long relied on U.S. sanctions waivers to import Iranian electricity. Congress could also revisit long-standing sanctions exemptions for humanitarian trade, weighing them against the broader goal of pressuring the Iranian government and the interest some members have expressed in supporting the Iranian people. This concludes my brief remarks. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. We are going to now turn to member questions, and I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. I wish, honestly, I really do wish we had a long-form podcast kind of conversation that we could have here today, because there are so many avenues to explore in this. But I'll have 5 minutes. We'll all have 5 minutes, but I'm sure we will be having quite a bit of follow-up and on that. So, Mr. Noronha, yesterday at the National Security Subcommittee hearing, I entered into the record, as you had indicated, the report to Congress on renewal of Iraq's sanctions waiver for electricity payments. This is the Biden administration sanctions waiver for the payment of electricity by Iraq to Iran. So you have seen this document since yesterday?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. What are your immediate takeaways? I know you touched on a few of those things. Just explore that briefly.
So it struck me that they were trying to use the 2012 law, which was intended to reduce imports of Iranian oil.
And let's be clear, this is the 2012 NDAA.
Correct.
NDAA Act
yes,
under the Obama administration.
Correct. This was passed by bipartisan from Congress, signed into law by President Obama. This was intended to get Iran's oil and electricity revenues down, and instead, what it appears the administration used that law for is to, in my view, illegally create a channel where Iran could get euros.
Which was specifically the Korea situation, correct? Korea had a reliance on Iranian oil, and this was part of trying to wean them off of that.
So there were 8 countries that we were working to wean off their imports of Iranian oil. We couldn't do so overnight, and so we were trying to do this very fast. Iraq is a slightly separate case.
So yesterday you said immediately you were struck a little bit that Germany, France, and Oman were the 3 exceptions to that. Explore that briefly.
France, Germany, and Oman have never imported Iranian oil. They've never imported Iranian petroleum products. They were never given waivers by the Trump administration because they didn't need them.
So why in the world would they be included in this now?
It is, in my view, legal fiction that was used to somehow cite this law so that they could be the mechanism to launder funds from Iraq into euros for an Omani channel.
Mr. Goldberg, I'm going to turn to you. The administration obviously allowed the transfer of $10 billion from Iraq as well. Where do you suspect this money is now?
We don't have clarity on that. We do know that if you look back, and I document this in my written testimony, we have multiple statements from various Iranian officials and Iraqi officials in that May, June, July timeframe that give us this dollar figure. Some say $10 billion, $11 billion, but remember, Iraq is still importing electricity, so that money continues to grow. It's not one-time money like a frozen account in South Korea or the $3 billion that's still sitting in Japan or any money that's in Delhi or in Beijing that may have been on the docket for transfer in the future under this nuclear understanding. So this $10 billion, let's use that figure, that's a public number. Some amount of that was already paid out, $2.76 billion. We saw that. That was an initial allowance under a prior waiver in June. That was used to pay off various debts of the Iranians, including imports from Turkmenistan, according to public reporting. Then the rest of it, the balance at some point, is transferred under this new waiver, sir, that you've just entered into the record. In July, we have the State Department on record saying that they're designating Oman to be the custodian. This waiver now provides France and Germany in this as well. So clearly there is some movement of cash converting Iraqi dinar to euro in Europe and moving it into Oman. The balance in Oman is unknown. The balance in Iraq is unknown. The balance in France or Germany is unknown. But according to the waiver, these are the institutions that would be involved. And of course, we don't have the names of the institutions involved.
Is Oman known as a straight-up player in the banking industry?
Oman is viewed in some ways, in historical terms, worse than Qatar as far as playing all sides. We've seen public reporting in the past of their ties to the IRGC at times, smuggling routes through Oman and around Oman that the Iranians have used. They've been used, if you go back to 2015, 2013, right after Congress had enacted the two laws that we're really discussing here. That secret negotiation of the now National Security Advisor was with the Omanis to get to that JCPOA originally. That's why the Omanis were used again by Brett McGurk for this channel.
I've got just a few seconds and so much more. Any one of you, are you aware that there's a written agreement between the Qataris and the U.S.? And the same question on the Omanis. Because when we see White House spokespeople saying these funds are frozen, quote, it does not appear that they really are.
Mr. Chairman, there is a written agreement that outlines the hostage deal and the $6 billion payment. To my knowledge, I do not know of a written agreement pertaining to the potential freeze.
The waiver, I believe, sir, does make reference to communications. The committee should ask for all communications.
Okay. Appreciate that, and my time has expired. With that, the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning. Thank you to the chair and the ranking member for this timely hearing. Like so many of us, I was shocked and appalled by the horrific attacks on the people of Israel by Hamas terrorists. It is our duty to ensure that that never again happens anywhere, and this hearing and the work of the administration is imperative. I'm in a unique position here. I'm both a member of this committee as well as the Armed Services Committee, and so I've received both classified as well as attended closed-door hearings to better understand the events that occurred on the ground, the preparation and planning leading up to these despicable attacks, and most importantly, the actions available to us going forward. Let me be clear, the response from the United States must be unequivocal and project American strength internationally. We stand with our ally Israel and are willing to use any of the tools available to us to support that end. But we're here today to discuss one of those tools, one that is undoubtedly important, and we must take a serious look at solutions to mitigate the ability of Iran and any other state sponsor of terrorism to finance these kinds of horrific attacks around the globe. So it's imperative to deny Hamas and Russia access to illicit funds. I would like to enter into the record, Mr. Chairman, an article from Axios. Actually, the Deputy Secretary of Treasury is en route to Europe. He will be speaking to the Royal United Services Institute in London this Friday, and it's specifically around the issues on sanctions against these sponsors of terrorism.
Without objection, so moved.
Thank you. As we've heard, it likely took multiple years to plan the coordinated and multifaceted attack on October 7th. That means that there was likely multiple years of funding in spite of strict U.S. sanctions. While we know that Hamas isn't using U.S.-based financial institutions, they are able to still engage in the financial sector writ large. Mr. Thomas, would you please speak to the array of financing options available to Iran in spite of the sanctions regime, and what else can the United States government do to stem that flow of illicit funds?
Thank you, Congressman. With respect to Iran's support for Hamas, this is a relationship that goes back many decades, nearly to the inception of Hamas as a group in the late 1980s. Traditionally, Iranian financial support for Hamas has been estimated at about $100 million a year, although, as we've heard, there have been press reports citing Israeli sources indicating that that support may have increased in recent years, and there have been numbers as high as $350 million. Of course, Iran's support for Hamas is not limited to financial support. The means by which Iran provides material support to Hamas vary, right? Clearly, the nature of these illicit transactions makes tracking them difficult, but from what we know, Iran relies both on smuggling via tunnels under the Gaza-Egypt border. The Egyptian government has cracked down on those in large part since 2013, but there are indications that trade continues. In terms of Iran's financial status abroad in general, which I imagine we'll discuss at length today, those funds, pursuant to U.S. law and regulations, are limited to the use to fund transactions involving non-sanctioned humanitarian trade.
So on that point, we've heard many of my colleagues on the other side emphasize that money is fungible and that the dollar spent on humanitarian aid is a dollar that is freed up from the Iranian government to spend on financing terrorism. However, it seems that can only be true if they ever intended to spend money on that in the first place. So, Mr. Thomas, do you believe that without the $6 billion in funds that Iran would otherwise provide this same aid to its people? Yes or no?
I think given the history of Iran's support for these groups and its support for these groups in spite of the humanitarian needs of the Iranian people, Iran has continued to provide support for terrorist groups regardless of the economic situation.
Is there any indication that links past increases in humanitarian aid to an increase in availability of Iranian funds to finance terrorism, given the numerous controls that are in place?
Not that I'm aware of. Again, that support has remained consistent for years.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I think that your opening statements by this last discussion from our colleagues does tell us this is a bipartisan hearing. And thank you very much for doing that. Mr. Thomas, can you give us more information about how the Iranian accounts work, and are they special purpose accounts?
So these accounts really go back to 2012. We've discussed at length the FY 2012 National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA. That legislation, as I mentioned in my remarks, permits countries to continue to import Iranian oil, provided that they keep it in special purpose accounts, as you've described. The year after the 2012 NDAA was passed, Congress, as part of the 2013 NDAA, included a provision, subtitled D, IFCA, which Mr. Goldberg mentioned, the Iran Freedom and Counterproliferation Act. That act tightens those restrictions by mandating that purchases for Iranian oil, the funds from those purchases must remain in the purchasing country, not remitted to Iran. The conditions that govern the restrictions on those accounts are prescribed in U.S. law and U.S. regulation, namely that they must be used for bilateral non-sanctioned humanitarian trade that does not involve the Iranian government or Iranian entities. So, for example, funds in country X would be allowed to be drawn down to pay an exporter in country X to export humanitarian goods into Iran.
Thank you. Gentlemen, I would like for each one of you to take a whack at the question about the Qatar relationship with Iran, because it appears as though, from what I see, we do favorably count on Qatar and their relationship not only with us as a host country, but also as an intermediary. Can you please discuss that first, Mr. Goldberg? I'll have you first.
Congressman, it is a very important question and timely. I think important that for anybody who had views of Qatar's relationship with Iran, Qatar's relationship with Hamas before October 7th that didn't align with my view, I hope we can all reset assumptions at this point.
I think they reset it.
And we, exactly, sir, they did reset it. And any sort of hostage negotiations that are going on, if there's a hostage exchange today, I hear perhaps of some release of some women and children, we want to have everyone back that we can. We want all hostages released. But to understand that Qatar is playing us, it's the arsonist playing firefighter at this point and coming to our rescue. Oh, as we continue to host Hamas in our country, as they host a summit between the Iranians and Hamas after October 7th so they can coordinate in Doha the day after Secretary Blinken goes, while they continue to have financial channels, while Al Jazeera is spitting out horrible anti-American hate, incitement to violence, pro-Hamas propaganda. I think it's absolutely time for us to reassess that relationship. We have a lot of leverage there. Yes, they host the KAC. Yes, they host our Air Operations Center. Yes, Al Dhafra in the UAE could do it too.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Noronha.
Thank you. Qatar is more of a diplomatic and political partner to Iran than economic partner. They don't do much trade. I believe that we should try to rescind some of the agreements we've made with Qatar regarding Hamas. There was an agreement made in 2012 to host the political leadership office in Qatar. We should make a formal ask of the Qataris and say we want this office gone, and a formal extradition request for the leaders of Hamas who are currently in Qatar.
Would they not have recognized that themselves internally as a result of, quote, this reset? Or is that still part of the relationship that the United States needs to be out there pushing them this way?
It needs to be a formal ask. They're currently effectively the mediators for the hostage agreement, for the hostage talks. And so I think there's a different policy view of what should happen in the next 2 weeks versus what should happen after that.
You want to keep working with them. Mr. Thomas? Thank you, by the way, each of you.
So U.S. officials, as has been said, have credited Qatar for the role that it's played in the release of hostages. More broadly, again, Qatar does support some important U.S. interests. It does have a very multi-directional foreign policy in that it has relationships with Iran as well as with many other U.S. partners in the Middle East. And so, what I would say is that Secretary Blinken has said that business as usual with Hamas is over, and so I imagine going forward it's going to be balancing this kind of new approach with these longstanding U.S. interests with respect to Afghanistan, with respect to U.S. Facilities in Qatar, and this I imagine is going to be a place where Congress can play a role in overseeing what the administration's path with Qatar is going forward.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I would encourage us, as I know you will do, consider the region that we don't live in, but that we have vast interest in, and thank you very much. Thank you for your service to our country.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, Ms. Garcia from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses, thank you for being here on such a timely and very critical topic. Like most of my colleagues, I strongly condemn the horrific October 7th attacks carried out by Hamas in Israel. We have all seen the gruesome images and heard the heartbreaking stories of those impacted. In the aftermath of this tragedy, it is critical that we stand with our ally, Israel. I am proud to have supported passage yesterday of the bipartisan resolution expressing strong support for Israel in its right to defend herself against Hamas and other terrorist groups in the region. Iran plays a key role in the financing of terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Therefore, U.S. sanctions on Iran are critically important. I recently joined a bipartisan letter with my colleagues demanding Iran be held accountable for its role in funding Hamas and for the maximum enforcement of all U.S. sanctions in the region. We have heard testimony here today that places a lot of focus on the Biden administration's work this summer to free American prisoners in Iran. So I want to inquire further about the history of the financial relationship between Iran and its proxies. Mr. Thomas, can you speak a little more about the financial ties between Iran and groups like Hamas and Hezbollah?
So the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah is a little bit different than the relationship between Iran and Hamas. When we're talking about Hezbollah, Hezbollah is really kind of the crown jewel of Iran's regional network of proxies. Iranian support to Hezbollah is considered at about $1 billion a year, and I think that's a reflection of the much closer political and ideological ties that link Tehran to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hamas, on the other hand, has fewer of those kind of natural ties to Tehran. Again, and I think that's reflected in the support, which is generally estimated to be $100 million in recent years. Again, some estimates that it may be higher. In terms of how Iran provides support, as I said, much of this is covert and evasive. But what we do know is that Hamas does rely on kind of international networks of both licit and illicit financing. In the past, the Department of the Treasury has designated networks of financiers across the region for their role in providing support to Hamas and its activities. With respect to Iran, Hamas officials have said in the past that a lot of this is cash, right? I mean, they've talked about going to Tehran and coming back with suitcases of cash. So there's a wide variety of ways that Iran can use to support these groups. It's going to be a little bit harder with Hamas, given the restrictions on entry into and out of Gaza, as opposed to Hezbollah, which has a much larger presence in Lebanon.
So these suitcases of cash, what currency are they using, and what role is cryptocurrency playing?
So the report that I was referring to was from, I believe it was 2009, when Hezbollah figures talked about not being able to leave with Tehran because they had so much cash. I don't remember if they specified the currency. With respect to crypto, there have been reports, and I would defer to the testimony that you heard, or that some of your colleagues heard yesterday from Mr. Zarazinski. There have been reports that tens of millions of dollars in crypto funds have been interdicted by Israeli and U.S. authorities, and those funds were belonging to or on their way to Hamas. What I would say in context is, as I understand it, Hamas financing is a much larger portion of that is coming from the funds that Hamas generates by virtue of its de facto control of the Gaza Strip, and secondarily that $100 million or more that it received from Iran. So the crypto is, I imagine, a little bit less than those other sources of funding, but any provision of financial resources to Hamas would be of major concern to U.S. policymakers and likely sanctionable under U.S. law.
So did Iran actually receive any of the $6 billion transferred in exchange for the release of the prisoners?
U.S. officials said on October 8th, I believe for the first time, that none of the funds had been drawn down, and that appears to still be the case. U.S. officials maintain that
none have been dispersed.
Yes, ma'am.
Right. Just want to make sure that we get that on the record again. So the U.S. Treasury Department recently sanctioned individuals and businesses in South America accused of financing Hezbollah. Mr. Thomas, can you speak to the dangers that groups like Hezbollah and Hamas pose beyond the Middle East?
Very quickly, Hezbollah in particular does have networks in South America, largely drawing on expat populations that they're able to secure funding from and secure support from. And this is an issue of longstanding concern going back, I would say, well over a decade. And Congress has looked at this issue. As you say, the administration has sanctioned numerous officials for their participation in this trade as well.
Tthank you. And Mr. Chair, if the witness would provide any other detail on that, my last question, it really would be great. I think he was...
The chair will entertain written questions to the chair, which we will then pass along.
Right.
So
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair.
If you'd like an expansion, you may put that down in writing, and we will pass that along to our witnesses.
Thank you.
With that, the gentlelady from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, who is also the vice chair of our Foreign Affairs Committee and the chair of the Capital Markets Subcommittee here on Financial Services. You have 5 minutes.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On this very past anniversary of 9/11, the Biden administration announced this reckless and extremely dangerous deal with Iran, a state sponsor of terror. President Biden's decision to release $6 billion in Iranian funds is nothing short of a windfall of cash and economic relief for Tehran to use for its military and to fund terrorist proxies like, as we've spoken, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. This was a shameful payout to a regime that is responsible for countless deaths, including Americans. Less than a month later, Hamas and Iran-funded terrorist group launched the deadliest attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Let's be clear about Iran's role in the Middle East. It is the world's worst state sponsor of terror, and it is bent on attacking U.S. and Israeli interests with every resource it can muster. This money should never have been released in the first place. And now the U.S. must claw it back to ensure that they cannot be used to further in efforts to further by Iran or Hamas to target Israel. Mr. Noronha, the Biden administration has mentioned a, quote, quiet understanding with Qatar regarding the $6 billion in Iranian funds exchanged in the hostage deal. What does a quiet understanding look like in practice?
It means nothing at all, because a quiet understanding has no legal basis. It does not legally prevent Qatar from distributing those funds to Iran in the future. And more importantly, in my mind, it does not prevent or discourage Iran from taking, say, Qatari or American hostages to say, okay, now you really have to turn that spigot back on. We've made this practice now of saying you can get cash for hostages. And now that that practice has been exemplified to the Iranian regime, they will use and abuse that as long as this is a possibility.
Thank you. And Mr. Goldberg, the Biden administration said that the $6 billion in accounts in Qatar could only be used for humanitarian purposes. Can you explain why that is impossible to ensure, given the fact that we all know that money is fungible?
Thank you for the question, ma'am. They also said this about the $10 billion going to Oman, the same language used by Mr. Miller at the State Department, so that's why we should take a close look at what's been spent there, too. Obviously, money is fungible, so even if they say this is all for non-sanctions goods, by the way, which is wider than what we traditionally think of as humanitarian, because there's all kinds of debts that can be paid off in that respect as budget support, even if you accept that, we also know and have documented, as Mr. Noronha went through yesterday, so many times in history when Iran has filed paperwork that's fraudulent, front companies, false transactions that have gone to money laundering, that have gone to the IRGC, gone to Assad in Syria, Hulk Bank in Turkey. Remember that massive scandal still being prosecuted today? That was all based on humanitarian transactions, billions of dollars of a scheme that Iran had cooked up and nobody caught it.
Let me press on. Mr. Noronha, approximately how much money does Iran provide to Hamas each year? And would the terrorist attacks that Hamas perpetrated on October 7th have been possible without that Iranian support, including financial support?
They historically provided $100 million. During maximum pressure, they had to institute an austerity plan. They had to lay off a bunch of fighters. They were really struggling on budgets. That since 2021, that funding has increased as much as $350 million. And my view is their strategic surprise would not have been possible.
So the sanctions were working when we had forced them into their austerity plan, so they could not, in fact, fund these terrorist proxies to the extent that they are currently. One other question, because it just rubs me wrong, Mr. Goldberg. Why was the foreign minister of Iran, why does he have a visa to be in New York City right now? I was reading about it earlier today. It's absolutely unbelievable to me that this man who was working on plotting with Hamas an attack against Israel has been given a visa and is currently, this foreign minister is in New York City. Sir.
Completely shameful, ma'am. There are Americans held hostage. Iran is complicit. There are Americans dead. This man should not be in the country.
With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. With that, the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Williams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huizenga and Ranking Member Green. I agree with you, Chairman Huizenga. I wish that this could be a roundtable discussion, more of a dialogue, that we could have a much more robust discussion and conversation, because I'm going to tell you now I have many questions that I'm going to need answered for the record that I will be submitting, because we're not going to get through all of this today. I thank you for joining us today, to all of our witnesses. Y'all, I am heartbroken by the continued loss, not just on October 7th, but is continuing today, of the loss of innocent Israeli, Palestinian, and American lives in Gaza and Israel. In no way, shape, or form is terrorism ever acceptable. Congress and our president, y'all, we have a responsibility to respond swiftly and humanely when our allies need us. But at the time of an unprecedented attack on one of our most critical allies, Israel, Congress was frozen and unable to take any action to aid Israel provide global leadership. Only yesterday, a full 2.5 weeks after the attack occurred, did the House vote to condemn Hamas's vicious terror attack and affirm our support for Israel. I've been getting texts, calls, and emails from rabbis and other members of the Jewish community in my district in Atlanta urging Congress to take action since October 7th. But again, under Republican leadership, it took 2.5 weeks for this body to officially condemn this heinous terrorist attack. extreme MAGA Republicans pose a real threat to our national security when things happen like kicking out their own speaker and 22 days lapse without a speaker, and then replacing our speaker with the chief legal architect to overturn the 2020 presidential election results. And I'm from Georgia, y'all, so it hits a little different for me. In Congress, I always center the most marginalized, and it pains me as a mama and a leader in this country, and as the co-chair of the bipartisan Black Jewish Caucus, that Congress was paralyzed and couldn't properly respond while innocent civilians and babies, y'all, were being killed. It is our responsibility to ensure that our foreign policy not only stands up for marginalized people, but holds those accountable, facilitating the financing of terrorism accountable. Mr. Thomas, if necessary, how can the U.S. structure additional sanctions on Iran to maximize the impact on political leaders and minimize the impact on everyday Iranians?
So this is a debate central to Iran sanctions, but it's much broader than Iran, right? I mean, Congress has long wrestled, and successive administrations have wrestled with the dilemma of how to hold regimes that the United States finds objectionable accountable while not bringing harm to the populations over which those regimes rule. Congress, again, has, I think the way that Congress has tried to do that in the Iran space is by creating specific humanitarian exemptions for sanctions. Those aren't always perfect, right? And there are reports of diversion. I think at this point, Congress, basically the situation in which the Biden administration is operating is a sanctions architecture created by Congress. And that refers both to the waivers that the administration has used and going back to previous administrations, as well as the authorities that they have used. And so if Congress decides that the indirect or ancillary benefits to the Iranian regime of those waivers are, if those are greater than the benefits that the Iranian people receive, then Congress could perhaps take a look at revising those authorities.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. I'm also concerned about the continued push that I hear from some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to pull back from the United States' role in protecting democracy and facilitating global cooperation, especially after witnessing the importance of the U.S.-Israeli partnership firsthand just last month as I visited Israel on a Congressional Black Caucus delegation trip. It is clear to me that we need to engage with the rest of the world, not hide from it. Mr. Thomas, how did the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and the Paris Climate Agreement impact our ability to work with European allies and conduct diplomacy in the Middle East?
So the Trump administration's decision in 2018 to cease U.S. participation in the JCPOA was welcomed by some U.S. partners and was strongly criticized by others. In the region, a number of U.S. partners welcomed the decision. But as you say, in Europe, many European allies saw the JCPOA as a critical international diplomatic achievement and sought to preserve the benefits. Ultimately, that was not possible. While the JCPOA is still technically in effect, obviously we've seen Iran surpass its requirements under the JCPOA, and the U.S. Has moved beyond even where it was in 2018 in terms of sanctions. In terms of the kind of broader impact, where the Biden administration appears to be now is, really engaging with partners, including—
Mr. Thomas, unfortunately, I'm out of time, which I knew would happen, and I have many more questions to submit for answers on the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huizenga, for holding this incredibly important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I know you've had a busy week. I would like to start off by saying how incredibly disappointed I have been in the Biden administration's lax on Iran policies. Iran is a longtime state sponsor of terror and a major supporter of Hamas. The unspeakable terrorist attacks that occurred in Israel by Hamas have left all of us sick over the barbarity of these atrocities committed against Israelis, Americans, and numerous other nationalities. It is crystal clear that Hamas and Hamas's benefactor, Iran, have zero regard for the sanctity of human life. It greatly concerns me that the Biden administration has recently allowed billions of dollars in Iranian funds to be transferred around the globe in an opaque and completely non-transparent manner. It is absolutely essential that Congress fully understand how these money transfers were allowed and the current status of these Iranian funds. And Mr. Chairman, I might note, we don't need necessarily more sanctions. We need the ones we have to be enforced by this administration. Now, Mr. Thomas, are you aware of any database or set of information available from Treasury that allows the public to understand where Iran's money is in the world?
I am not.
And Mr. Noronha, do you think it would be in the public interest for Treasury to publish data that will help to allow the public to understand where Iran's money is in the world?
Absolutely, and I think it would help Congress do its oversight job and not just rely on the executive branch to do what Congress tells it to do.
In September, the administration established a new humanitarian channel in Qatar to administer $6 billion in Iranian assets from South Korea. Treasury describes this channel as a way to, quote, further facilitate the flow of humanitarian assistance to the people of Iran. Mr. Thomas, is it unusual for Treasury to create a humanitarian channel? And why would Treasury need to create a humanitarian channel?
I think probably the closest analog to the humanitarian channel in Qatar was the Swiss humanitarian trade arrangement, which was set up by the Trump administration in February of 2020. That was based on October 2019 understandings between state and Treasury to basically create mechanisms to facilitate humanitarian trade into Iran. In terms of why it's necessary, I believe the intent is to give basically extra cover to private organizations, private businesses that want to participate in this trade, but otherwise might be deterred for fear of U.S. sanctions. So it's basically telling people that want to participate in this, you will not be exposed to U.S. sanctions if you participate in humanitarian transactions involving Iran. That doesn't mean that those businesses are going to participate in it, right? I mean, you can open the door, but you can't force anybody to walk through. And my understanding with the Swiss humanitarian trade arrangement is that only several transactions were processed through it.
Is there a stark difference between a humanitarian channel and other escrow accounts that are available to Iran for humanitarian trade purposes?
It's difficult to say with respect to the humanitarian channel in Qatar. As you said, that was announced by the Treasury Department in mid-September. And as of early October, it appears that the circumstances surrounding those funds have changed, although, as I note, the administration has not made an official statement on the status of those funds. Based on the arrangements that governed the Swiss humanitarian channel, I would imagine that that basically it's increased due diligence requirements on the financial institutions involved in processing those transactions.
In your opinion, is there enough information publicly available on the humanitarian channels to understand how effective they have been in the past or how this one might be in getting the appropriate assistance to Iranian citizens themselves?
I think we already see Congress starting to take this up as an oversight mechanism. I would point you to H.R. 5826, which was marked up in the House Foreign Affairs Committee last week. That legislation would require biannual, every 6 months, reports from the administration specifically on the $6 billion in Qatar. But I don't think there's any reason why Congress couldn't broaden that reporting requirement to try to have more visibility, as Mr. Noronha said, into where those funds are and what the status of them is.
Thank you. I see my time is about to expire. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, the gentleman from Texas, the ranking member, Mr. Green, is recognized for 5 minutes. You have another member. Yeah, he's going to go last.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I greatly appreciate the commentary of Mr. Goldberg, my questions were not directed to Mr. Goldberg. And there's a reason I didn't direct my questions to Mr. Goldberg. Mr. Goldberg is not a member of Congress. Mr. Goldberg doesn't have a vote. Mr. Goldberg has an opinion, and I respect his opinion. But my questions were directed to the members of Congress who have the opportunity to vote. Now, to you, Mr. Thomas, you indicated that the architecture for the transaction that took place, the $6 billion, was created by Congress. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I'm referring specifically to Section 1245 of the FY 2012 NDA, as well as additional restrictions added by the Iran Freedom and Counterproliferation Act in the next year's NDA.
And for edification purposes, you are with what entity, please?
I am a specialist in Middle Eastern affairs at the Congressional Research Service.
And that is an entity associated with what organization or what body, please?
We are part of the Library of Congress. We provide nonpartisan, authoritative information and analysis to all 535 members of Congress and their staff, all committees, and we work equally on behalf of all members of Congress.
The transaction that took place, the $6 billion in question, did that transaction take place in contravention of the law?
The administration issued waivers on September 11th pursuant to Section 1245 of the NDAA to facilitate the transfer of those funds from South Korea to Qatar.
And if those funds never get to Iran, can they be fungible as they relate to spending in Iran?
So I would say that the terms governing the use of those funds are the same as the restrictions that govern the use of Iranian funds that are held anywhere in the world, namely that they can only be used for non-sanctioned bilateral humanitarian trade. And that's the system that Congress set up, right? So that these funds had to stay in the jurisdiction where they originated and not ever basically touch Iran.
Mm. And the same Congress that produced this architecture that you called to my attention is a Congress that can change this architecture. Is that a fair statement?
Exactly.
They have a vote.
Yes, sir.
You don't have a vote, do you, Mr. Thomas? You work for an entity associated with Congress, but you don't have a vote, do you?
I do not, sir. I'm not a member of Congress.
Okay. So I think it's pretty fair to say that we, the members of Congress, may have some responsibilities, but what you have is an opinion, as is the case with the other witnesses. Now, moving on to something else. Hamas is a terrorist organization. What they did was a crime against humanity. Should never happen again. But I've lived long enough now and have the courage enough to say that we ought not allow innocent people, regardless of their place of origin, to be killed. I care about babies in Israel, but I also care about babies in Palestine. Those babies have lives too. We ought to be concerned about all babies. And we ought to be concerned about not just winning a war, but winning the peace. You can win a war and lose the peace. How you execute a war has a lot to do with the peace you will have. And I will tell you that while I did not did not co-sign the resolution, and there's a reason. I believe that we should have had language in there about a two-state solution to this problem. Because if Congress doesn't go on record, we give the impression that we may be abandoning the two-state solution. I have not abandoned it. I voted to fund these agreements that we've had with Israel. Each and every one of them. But I did it because I thought we'd have a two-state solution. And without a two-state solution, I don't see a path to peace. I thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. And I will note that, yes, we all do have a vote up here, and we're responsible for those votes and explaining those to our constituents. We also have staff that we rely on as well, and I've appreciated those opinions from former staff who have helped us as members.
In response to your comment, Mr. Chairman, which you allowed yourself time for, I just asked for equal time. I respect the comments of staff too. I have no problem with staff. It's just that
excellent.
We have the votes.
There we go. With that, gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. for this very important hearing, and certainly thank you to our witnesses. Appreciate your information very, very much. It's pretty serious stuff. So the Biden administration, Mr. Goldberg, had secretly made available to Iran since May $50 billion for nothing more than a promise that Iran would not provoke an immediate nuclear crisis by producing weapons-grade uranium. This package did include the $6 billion transferred to Qatar. So when I met with the IAEA last year, they were very clear that Iran was in all kinds of violations, and they were making a trip there within about a week to express to them that they're in complete violation of any sort of, the so-called deal that was being made, the Iran nuke deal. So, what are your thoughts there? Why would the administration continue to work with some sort of deal? By the way, a member, a colleague in the hearing yesterday, if you remember, stated that would go down in history as one of the greatest flaws ever that the previous administration had gotten out of that. I don't know what kind of agreement there is when one side just blatantly doesn't follow it, doesn't allow surprise inspections. You give them a month's notice to show up, and then they can tell when the uranium was moved and how much was actually extracted from the area. Yet, this Biden administration continues to try to work with this Iranian terrorist state. So why do you think that is?
Congressman, listen, as a staff member to people who voted many years ago, when I wrote both of the sanctions laws we're talking about, and they passed 100 to nothing and 94 to nothing in the Senate and unanimous consent here in the House, and I thank everybody who voted on it at the time and the staff that worked on it.
Yeah.
I would say that at that time we had a bipartisan consensus that more money for the Islamic Republic of Iran was bad, and that we should continue to pressure, contain, roll back that regime across all of its malign activities. That changed during the JCPOA. We've gone into camps. It's ideological. It's political. And we advise the administration.
It's amazing the level of Iranian sympathizing that's taking place. I hear you. And now, you wrote, I think, we now see the results of policies of appeasement and that enrich the world's leading state sponsor of terror. And then we just go on. And I want to talk to Mr. Noronha and Thomas as well. I mean, there's no debating that things such as, the increase of exports, 1.5 million barrels per day, the highest monthly rate since 2018. There's no getting around those facts and the level of funding that's coming into Iran, the sponsor of terror, that is clear and known to Democrats and Republicans. That's happening. And yet at the same time, they're selling it to China at discounts, right? And we know this, and it's also stated there is no way for Iran to boost its exports to this extent without the White House ordering the non-enforcement of U.S. sanctions and providing clear signals to Beijing that U.S. sanctions will not be enforced. What is going on here? Mr. Noronha, I ask you.
$150 million a day in Iranian oil revenue is currently what's happening. And that does not go to the Iranian central budget. That goes to the IRGC's budget. They have a special deal. They get the Iranian oil revenue. Respectively, sir, that's exactly what's happening. It's a funneling for terror financing across the Middle East that reaches to Washington, D.C., because there are assassination attempts here in this capital ongoing.
So, Mr. Thomas, let me, allowing the missile embargo on Iran to expire grants international legitimacy to Iran's transfer of armed drones to Russia, who were sending billions and billions of American taxpayer dollars to the Ukraine, and yet we're allowing this to help fund Russian drones and ballistic missiles. What do you think about that?
So the sunset that you're referring to that happened this week did draw condemnation from a number of members of Congress. It also drew attention in Europe, which has been the focus of a number of members who have sought to have European partners of the United States join U.S. efforts to continue those restrictions.
I want to ask you a question. Do we have any documentation or any reason to believe, or is there any facts or connection to the idea that there may be a transfer of funds from Iran to any member of the Biden family? Anybody have any information on that? If you
Gentleman's
do,
time
please let me know. I yield back.
Gentleman can pose that question in writing if he so chooses. With that, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stile, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Huizenga, thank you for holding today's hearing, and thank you for waving me on to the subcommittee. It's such an important topic that we're discussing and incredibly timely following the attack by terrorists from Hamas against defenseless Israeli citizens. And when we see Iran as the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, and we look at the Biden administration's policy allowing Iran to have access to funds, I think it's imperative that we in Congress examine that and move this administration in a new and different direction. I think the direction that this administration has been on, providing access to funds to Iran, looking the other way as it relates to oil sanctions in particular, where billions of dollars are being able to move into Iranian-controlled coffers, is incredibly dangerous. And so I want to dig in a little bit, if I can. I want to start with you, Mr. Noronha. Walk us through a little bit of how these funds are flowing, because I think it's really imperative for the American people to understand. We had the Biden administration come forward and say that the Iranians don't have access to these funds in Qatar, yet clearly they issued the waiver and then a license to transfer those funds to Qatar. Last year in the NDAA, I successfully got an amendment passed, signed into law, that will force this administration to disclose those types of licenses. Waivers previously were forced under 2012. Now we have access to the licenses, so we can actually see with transparency how this administration is giving deference and giving access to Iran. We now know it went to Qatar. Do we actually have any proof that what the administration is saying as it relates to these funds, that the Iranians don't have access, that they haven't done that? What's the proof on this?
There has been no documentation sent over to Congress. They did not affirmatively provide the package, the written agreement to Congress. I think one point that's relevant here, the laws that we've been describing here from 2012, they allowed bilateral trade in South Korean won to Iran. They didn't allow for euros and dollars. That is a permissive waiver and granting of a concession to Iran to allow that money.
So I think that's really important. So that's the actual waiver of the actual waiver, and then they provide the license to transfer that over to Qatar such that they can be dealing in a much more liquid currency form. Is that right?
That's correct. If they wanted to buy food and medicine from South Korea, they could have. They chose not to. They don't want, again, it's not, the emphasis is not on helping the Iranian people.
So someone should be suspect. Why would they not want to buy, maybe some food or some medical supplies loaded onto a boat in South Korea that would then go over to Iran, and maybe they could at least argue that they're trying to help people, that they're not going to pilfer these things off the top. Why would all of a sudden they want access to euros?
Because euros are what Hezbollah and Hamas want at the end of the day, and it's much easier to do this if it's in those currencies.
So the administration was hoping everyone would look the other way on the transfer of these funds to Qatar, and most likely most of the international community would have, but for the attack by terrorists from Hamas into Israel, where the world's attention turned to this region once again. And the administration was exposed on their poor decision to allow the transfer of these funds from custody in South Korea to Qatar. Is that accurate?
I believe that is, sir.
And so let's dive in one step further. You made, I think, an important point about the administration looking the other way as it relates to oil sales, which from a dollar standpoint, or from a value standpoint, dollar, euro, whatever currency they're operating in, is probably a more relevant discussion point. And this administration has looked the other way while Iran has been able to transfer oil to China as well as Syria. Is that accurate?
They have been notified many times of all the tankers that are evading their sanctions.
And why
all of these, and they haven't done it.
And why is the administration looking the other way?
Because they want to advance their nuclear deal with Iran, which is a broader political objective.
And who gets the funds?
Iran at the end of the day.
Does it go to the central bank account? Does it go to a food organization? Does it get at least some warm and fuzzy operation in Iran so they could at least pretend they're doing the right thing with this?
It's a complicated international financial network. It's not easy for them to move things under sanctions. Sanctions make it harder, which is the point. but it's sort of it's like a sieve. It slowly drips in and comes back into Iran.
And in particular, when Iran has access to new funds, it's like a gift card that gives Iran the ability to purchase other things. And as we know, Iran's the leading state sponsor of terrorism around the globe. And ultimately, I'm wildly concerned these funds are falling into the hands of operations like Hezbollah and Hamas. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Ogles, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I want to touch on something that Mr. Muser said and that you mentioned in kind of passing, Mr. Noronha, is the idea that Iran has somehow been involved in attempted assassinations on U.S. soil. Can you please expand on that?
Iran is currently trying to assassinate my former boss, Brian Hook, who's testified before Congress multiple times. They're trying to assassinate Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, but also Democrats. They're trying to assassinate current officials of the Biden administration, General Mark Milley, who served both presidents, Masih Alinejad, who testified before Congress yesterday. They're trying to do it, and they have made active attempts, and I'll leave that to your imagination. They've been described in some Department of Justice filings, showing up on people's doorsteps with guns, getting within 100 feet of targets. A lot of our public servants have to live with 24-hour security details, and they've been living with them for 3 years, if not longer. That's not how Americans should have to live. This is not Republican, Democrat. This is a disgrace to our public servants who have served this country, both administrations, and shouldn't have to be treated this way.
So, to emphasize, both Republicans and Democrats live under constant fear. It's documented, we know it, because of assassination attempts or plans against their lives. Is that fair?
That is, sir.
Is it reasonable to assume that giving Iran or Qatar or any mechanism by which money would flow into Iran would somehow aid and abet the missions to kill Americans on U.S. soil?
These operations are expensive. They need the money to do it. They have bounties of up to $1 million on the heads of each of these Americans. That money is absolutely subsidizing these assassination threats. They would probably still try to do them, but it makes their job much easier.
Would it be in the best interest of our homeland and the aforementioned individuals whose lives are under a fatwa or assassination orders that these monies be pulled back and blocked?
I believe it could save their lives, at least some of their lives, if we do so.
Mr. Goldberg, do you have any comments?
No, sir. The leading state sponsor of terrorism with active plots to kill Americans should not have access to a nickel if we can stop it.
Would you like to say that again a little louder? So on that, Mr. Stile mentioned Qatar. What active role has Qatar played in essentially allowing, aiding Iran to get around sanctions, which then allows monies to flow to these active terrorist organizations, sponsor of state terrorism, the literal active ongoing assassination attempts against former and current public officials? Mr.
My understanding is that separate of the $6 billion which we're debating, Qatar is not typically an economic partner of Iran. They're not typically the sanctions-busting jurisdiction involved here.
Mr. Goldberg?
Listen, in general, we should have a principle, which is there's no access to cash, there's no relationships, there's no safe harbor. You should not be in the capital of Qatar in Doha and have a summit between the Iranian foreign minister and the head of Hamas. And then, by the way, allow that same Iranian foreign minister, who was also in Beirut earlier this summer before the attacks, to come to New York on a visa.
Well, so Mr. Goldberg, when you look at the $6 billion Iran deal, there was a prisoner swap, obviously the funds. In my opinion, it's appeasement, but can you give us broader scope of that deal and, again, the risk associated with it as, again, we have a minute, so I'm going to give you the floor, but the unintended consequences of this, again, appeasement of state terror?
I think it's a very important time to zoom out and think about this at a strategic level. Right now, we've all talked about the brink of regional war. Why would we be on a brink of regional war? Because Iran is not deterred. Why is Iran not deterred? Because as much as the president says, I'm going to send another carrier strike group, don't do it, Iran, they also at the same time see a posture of saying, how much money can we make available to you so that we don't have to confront you if you continue to escalate your nuclear program? So long as you have $10 billion plus in a waiver that's continuing to build up money available to the regime in Oman. $6 billion moved from South Korea. All the oil that's flowing, it is not possible to allow that much oil to go without having built up sanctions targets that you're sitting on, that you're not imposing sanctions on, and not talking to Beijing about it first. All of that, $50 billion or more, the $80 billion since 2021, it all needs to stop. Otherwise, they will continue to push and push until this escalates further.
Mr. Goldberg, real quickly, is the world a more dangerous place because of the $6 billion?
Gentleman's time has expired.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
All right. I would like to thank all of our witnesses for their testimony today and, frankly, for your current and past service to our country and to the various legislative and executive organizations that have helped this government. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which we will then forward to the witnesses for your response. We just request that you respond to those as promptly as you are able to. And at some point, we're going to need to explore doing this on a podcast format. I believe this is something between 2 hearings, yesterday a hearing, today a hearing. There's a hearing happening in the U.S. Senate right now as well. This is certainly at the forefront of many of the conversations that are happening in Congress writ large, and I think around the world. So with that, this hearing is adjourned.